The Weight of Giants, a story of compassion at the edge of survival. The African sun hadn't yet burned through the morning mist when Dr. Elena Paris received the call that would define the next 72 hours of her life and fundamentally alter her understanding of gratitude between species. 27 years of wildlife veterinary work across 3 continents had prepared her for almost everything. Almost. Doc, we need you at the Southern Reserve. Now, the voice belonged to Marcus Evans, the lead ranger whose usually steady tone carried an edge of urgency that made Elena's hand pause over her coffee cup. It's a giraffe, adult male, massive abdominal growth. He collapsed at dawn, a giraffe. The gentle giants of the savanna, whose hearts alone weighed 25 pounds and pumped blood up those impossible necks against gravity's relentless pull. Elena knew that when a giraffe went down, every minute counted. Their unique physiology, that same magnificent design that allowed them to browse leaves 20 feet above the ground, became their greatest vulnerability when horizontal. Blood pressure could spike fatally. Organs could fail under their own weight. "How long has he been down?" Elena asked, already mentally cataloging the medical supplies she'd need. "Maybe an hour, maybe more." "The growth, Doc." Marcus paused, and in that silence, Elena heard everything she needed to know. "It's massive, bigger than anything I've ever seen. The whole ventral abdomen. He can barely walk. The other giraffes, they're standing guard around him." This last detail made Elena's throat tighten. Giraffes, despite their serene appearance, were deeply social creatures. They mourned their dead. They protected their vulnerable, and sometimes, in cases that science couldn't quite explain, they seemed to understand when humans came to help. Before we continue with this remarkable rescue, consider for a moment, have you ever witnessed an animal recognize human kindness? Not the trained response of a pet, but that moment of wild understanding when 2 species meet as equals in compassion. Share your experience in the comments below. These connections shape how we see our place in the natural world. Dr. Elena Paris wasn't alone in this mission. As her Land Rover kicked up red dust across the 20-kilometer stretch to the Southern Reserve, her radio crackled with updates from the assembling team. There was Dr. James Lee, barely 30 but already one of the most talented wildlife anesthesiologists in East Africa, whose gentle demeanor belied nerves of steel when calculating sedation doses for megafauna. Sarah Chen, the wildlife photographer, turned emergency response coordinator, whose images had raised millions for conservation, but who never hesitated to put down her camera when hands were needed for rescue. Ben Mwangi, whose grandfather had been one of the first Maasai rangers in the reserve, and who could read animal behavior like others read books. And then there was the helicopter team, Captain Jessica Thompson, who'd flown medical evacuations in Afghanistan before finding her calling in wildlife rescue, and her spotter, David Okonkwo, whose eagle eyes had saved more animals than anyone could count. This wasn't just a rescue team, it was a fellowship of souls who'd chosen to stand at the intersection of wild and human, who understood that every rescue was a conversation between species about what compassion meant in a world increasingly stripped of it. The scene that greeted Elena would be seared into her memory forever. The giraffe, they would later name him Messiah, though no one could quite remember who chose that name or why lay on his left side in the red earth. His magnificent spotted coat dulled with dust and sweat, but it was the growth that stole Elena's breath. Attached to his lower abdomen was a mass the size of a large watermelon, possibly larger, its surface showing the telltale signs of superficial necrosis. The vascularization was extensive. She could see the blood vessels from 20 feet away, a network of purple and red spreading like roots across the growth's surface. This wasn't just a tumor, it was a parasitic mass that had been stealing life from this magnificent creature for months, maybe longer. Around Messiah, in a rough circle about 30 meters in diameter, stood 7 other giraffes. They shifted nervously as the vehicles approached, but didn't flee. One, an elderly female with distinctive diamond-shaped patches, repeatedly lowered her great head toward Messiah, her dark tongue extending to touch his neck, in what could only be described as a gesture of comfort. "My God," whispered James Lee, pulling up beside Elena. "The size of it, the blood supply alone, if we try to remove that in the field, we'll lose him to hemorrhage," Elena finished. "I know, but looking at Messiah's eyes, those impossibly long-lashed eyes that held pain, yes, but also a fierce will to survive." Elena knew they had to try something. In wildlife rescue, there were no guaranteed outcomes. There were only choices made with incomplete information, skilled hands, and hearts that refused to accept defeat. "All right, team," Elena spoke into her radio, her voice carrying the authority earned through thousands of hours in situations exactly like this, and nothing like this at all. "This is what we're dealing with. Adult male giraffe, approximately 15 years old, weight estimated at 1,800 kilograms. Massive ventral abdominal growth, heavily vascularized, showing signs of necrosis at the base. He's been down for approximately 90 minutes. Marcus, I need you to slowly move the other giraffes back. Use the vehicles to create a barrier. But gently, they're his family. They need to see we're helping, not harming." The dance that followed was one of choreographed chaos. Ben and two other rangers slowly maneuvered their vehicles, not aggressively but with the patient insistence of water-shaping stone, until the watching giraffes had moved to a safer distance. They didn't go far. The elderly female in particular kept stretching her neck over the vehicle, those dark eyes never leaving Messiah. James was already calculating sedation doses, his tablet covered in numbers that would make most veterinarians' heads spin. "Standard dose won't work," he muttered. "The stress, the tumor, the compromised circulation. If his blood pressure drops on induction, it'll kill him," Elena agreed. "So we go with Protocol 7. Light sedation, local anesthesia for the biopsy, supportive care throughout. We stabilize, we sample, we transport." Transport? Sarah Chen had arrived, her cameras forgotten in the vehicle, her hands already pulling on surgical gloves. "The nearest surgical facility, equipped for megafauna, is 6 hours by truck," Elena confirmed. "Jess, can your bird handle the weight?" Captain Thompson's voice crackled over the radio. "Negative on internal carry, but we've got the heavy sling system. Used it for that elephant last year. If we can get him stable and secured, we can transport externally. Flight time to the facility would be 90 minutes, maybe less with favorable winds." 90 minutes? For a giraffe under sedation, carrying a massive tumor, having already endured the trauma of collapse, it might as well have been 90 hours. But it was better than 6 hours by road over rough terrain. "Let's do it," Elena decided. "James, draw up the sedation, light as we can manage. Ben, Sarah, I need you on head and neck support the moment he's under. That neck cannot, I repeat, cannot be allowed to fold or twist. David, get eyes on those other giraffes. If they charge, we need warning. Everyone else, prepare for emergency field stabilization." What many people don't realize about giraffe sedation is that it's perhaps the most dangerous procedure in large animal veterinary medicine. Their unique cardiovascular system, designed to pump blood up that impossible neck against gravity, becomes a liability under sedation. The blood pressure regulation that allows them to lower their heads to drink without passing out can fail catastrophically under anesthesia. More giraffes die from sedation complications than from the conditions that required sedation in the first place. James approached with a dart gun, his hands steady despite the weight of what they were attempting. Optimal sight is the shoulder, but with him down like this. "Upper hip," Elena directed. "The muscle mass is good there, and we can avoid any additional stress on his cardiovascular system." The dart flew true, the bright orange fletching marking its location in Messiah's hide. Now came the waiting. Unlike in movies, large animal sedation isn't instant. It's a gradual descent, a negotiation between chemistry and physiology, and with giraffes, it's a negotiation where nature holds all the cards. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Messiah's breathing, which had been rapid and stressed, began to slow. His eyes, which had been tracking their movements with that mixture of fear and hope that Elena had seen too many times, began to lose focus. "He's going," James announced. "Head team, move in now." Cautiously, he might have one kick left in him. Ben and Sarah approached like dancers, their movements synchronized from dozens of similar operations. Ben slipped a specially designed cushion under Messiah's great head, while Sarah positioned herself to support his neck, her whole body braced against the weight. "Pulse ox is steady at 45, James reported, wrapping a modified blood pressure cuff around Messiah's upper leg. "That's actually better than I expected. Blood pressure is holding 110/70. Not great, but not catastrophic." Elena was already examining the mass up close, her experienced hands palpating its edges, feeling for attachment points, assessing the level of integration with surrounding tissue. What she found made her stomach sink. The tumor wasn't just attached to the abdominal wall, it had integrated with it, blood vessels threading through like a malignant web. In a fully equipped surgical suite, with a team of specialists, removal would be challenging. In the field, it would be impossible. "Biopsy only," she announced, though everyone could hear the weight of that decision in her voice. "We sample, we transport. We hope the surgical team at the facility can do more." The biopsy itself was anticlimactic. A large bore needle, 3 quick samples from different areas of the mass, each one carefully labeled and stored. But it was what came next that would stay with everyone who witnessed it. As Elena withdrew the last biopsy needle, Messiah's eye, the one they could see from their position, suddenly focused. Not the vague, sedated acknowledgement of stimuli, but genuine focus. He looked directly at Elena, and in that gaze was something that transcended species, transcended science, transcended everything Elena thought she knew about animal cognition. It was recognition, not just of a presence, but of intent. He knew they were trying to help. "My grandfather would say his spirit is watching," Ben said quietly, his hands never leaving their support position on Messiah's head. He would say the animal chooses whether to trust the help offered. Whether it was coincidence or something more, Messiah's breathing steadied after that moment. His heart rate, which had been climbing worryingly, plateaued at a sustainable level. "Bring in the sling," Elena ordered, her voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Let's get him ready for transport." The heavy-duty rescue sling was a marvel of engineering, designed originally for lifting wounded horses in World War I, refined over decades for wildlife rescue, capable of supporting over 2 tons while distributing weight evenly to prevent pressure injuries. But watching it deployed around a giraffe, that most improbable of creatures, felt like watching physics itself hold its breath. "Pull the left webbing through," Jessica directed from her position by the helicopter, which had landed 50 meters away in a cloud of red dust. "Careful around the mass, we need to support it without putting pressure on it." 20 minutes of careful maneuvering, of hands working in concert, of held breaths, and whispered prayers to whatever forces govern the intersection of human compassion and animal survival, and Messiah was secured in the sling. "On my count," Elena commanded, "gentle lift to test the rigging. If anything shifts, we abort immediately. Ready? 1, 2, 3. The winch on the helicopter engaged with a mechanical whine that seemed too mundane for the moment's gravity. The sling tightened, took weight, and then, miracle of miracles, Messiah rose. Not far, just a few inches off the ground, but enough to confirm that the rigging would hold. "Vitals are stable," James reported, his voice tight with concentration. "Heart rate holding at 45. Blood pressure actually improved slightly with the position change. We'll go for transport if we move now." The journey that followed would become legend among the wildlife rescue community of East Africa. A helicopter flying low and slow across the savanna, a giraffe suspended beneath it, like something out of a fever dream, while on the ground, a convoy of vehicles raced alongside, ready to respond if anything went wrong. But perhaps most remarkable were the other giraffes. As the helicopter began its journey, the herd that had been standing vigil began to move, not away, but alongside, their great legs carrying them in that slow-motion gallop that only giraffes can achieve, following their fallen family member across the plain. The elderly female with the diamond patches led them, her neck stretched forward. And if giraffes could cry, Elena would have sworn she saw tears. They followed for 5 kilometers before finally stopping at the reserve boundary, standing like sentinels as the helicopter disappeared over the horizon. Marcus, watching through binoculars, would later report that they stood there for 3 more hours before finally moving away to feed. At the surgical facility, a state-of-the-art veterinary hospital built with conservation funds and managed by the University of Nairobi, a team of specialists was waiting. Dr. Robert Kimathi, one of only 3 veterinary oncologists in East Africa, had scrubbed in the moment he received Elena's call. The surgical suite, designed to accommodate everything from rhinos to elephants, had been reconfigured for its tallest patient ever. Malignant sarcoma, Dr. Kimathi confirmed as the initial biopsy results came through. Aggressive, which explains the size and the vascularization. But, and here he paused, studying the imaging results from the portable CT scanner. It's encapsulated. Barely, but it's encapsulated. We might, and I stress, might be able to remove it intact. The surgery that followed took 6 hours. 6 hours of careful dissection, of vessels ligated one by one, of prayers whispered in 4 different languages, of skilled hands working in concert to remove something that had no business being removed outside of a human hospital, much less from a giraffe in the African bush. But they did it. When Elena finally stepped out of the surgical suite, her scrubs soaked with sweat, her hands trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline, she found Sarah Chen waiting with her camera. "Did you get it?" Sarah asked, meaning the tumor. "We got it," Elena confirmed. And then, because the moment demanded honesty, whether he survives the recovery is another question entirely. Before we continue with what became one of the most remarkable recovery stories in wildlife medicine, take a moment to consider the convergence of factors that made this rescue possible. The skilled professionals, yes, but also the technology, the funding, the decades of accumulated knowledge about giraffe physiology, and perhaps most importantly, the collective decision by a group of humans that one giraffe's life was worth this enormous effort. In a world where we often hear only about humanity's negative impact on wildlife, stories like Messiah's remind us that we are also capable of extraordinary compassion. If this resonates with you, consider supporting your local wildlife rescue organization. Every contribution helps make rescues like this possible. The first 24 hours post-surgery were critical. Giraffes, unlike many animals, cannot remain lying down for extended periods. Their unique physiology requires them to stand, or fluid accumulates in ways that can quickly become fatal. The challenge was that Messiah had just undergone massive abdominal surgery. Standing too soon could tear sutures, cause hemorrhaging, or worse. Dr. Kimathi and Elena took shifts, monitoring vitals, adjusting medications, watching for any sign that Messiah's body was rejecting the intervention or succumbing to post-surgical complications. James Lee had calculated and recalculated the pain management protocol a dozen times, trying to find the perfect balance between keeping Messiah comfortable and keeping him alert enough to eventually stand. It was during Elena's 3 a.m. shift, 40 hours post-surgery, that it happened. She was adjusting his IV line, humming softly, a habit she'd developed over the years, believing that the sound helped calm her patients when she felt him shift. Not the restless movement of discomfort, but purposeful motion. "Hey there, big guy," she whispered, her hand automatically going to his neck in a calming gesture. "Not yet. You need more time." But Messiah had other plans. With a movement that seemed to defy everything Elena knew about post-surgical recovery, he rolled from his side to his sternum, his great legs folding beneath him in the position giraffes assumed before standing. "No, no, no," Elena muttered, reaching for the radio to call for backup. But before she could key the mic, Messiah turned his great head to look at her. Again, that gaze of impossible recognition, of understanding that transcended the barrier between species. And then, as if he were perfectly healthy, as if he hadn't just survived a surgery that would have killed most animals. Messiah stood up. It should have been impossible. The incision should have torn. He should have collapsed. At minimum, he should have shown signs of distress. Instead, he stood there, all 18 feet of him, his head nearly touching the reinforced ceiling of the recovery barn, and he looked down at Elena with what she could only describe as gratitude. "Well, Doctor," Kimathi's voice came from behind her, heavy with awe. "That's a first." The recovery that followed defied every expectation. Messiah's incision healed with minimal scarring. His appetite returned within days instead of weeks. Most remarkably, he showed none of the post-surgical depression common in wildlife recovering from major procedures. Instead, he seemed grateful. It was the only word that fit, unscientific as it was. He would lower his great head whenever Elena or any of the surgical team entered his enclosure, allowing them to examine him without sedation unprecedented for a wild giraffe. He took his medications hidden in brows without resistance. When it came time for suture removal, he stood perfectly still, those liquid eyes watching Elena work with what looked remarkably like trust. "In 30 years of wildlife medicine," Dr. Kimathi remarked one evening, watching Messiah gently accept a handful of acacia leaves from Elena, "I've never seen anything like this. It's as if he understands what we did for him." 6 weeks after the surgery, Messiah was ready for release. The tumor had been completely removed, the pathology confirmed it hadn't spread, and his strength had fully returned. The question was whether he could reintegrate with his herd giraffes, could be territorial, and an animal that had been gone this long, carrying human scent, might be rejected. The release site was carefully chosen, the same area where he'd collapsed, where his herd still frequented. As the transport truck approached in the early morning light, Elena saw them. 7 giraffes, including the elderly female with diamond patches, standing at the forest edge as if waiting. "How do they know?" Sarah Chen wondered aloud, her camera capturing every moment. "Same way he knew we were helping," Ben replied simply. "Some things don't need scientific explanation." The moment Messiah stepped out of the transport trailer would be replayed thousands of times in nature, documentaries, shared millions of times on social media, and become a symbol of successful wildlife intervention. But for those who were there, it was something more intimate, more profound. Messiah walked slowly toward his herd, his gait showing no sign of his ordeal. The elderly female was the first to approach, her neck twining around his in a gesture of unmistakable affection. One by one, the others joined, until all 8 giraffes stood in a tight group, heads touching, necks intertwined, in what could only be described as a celebration. Elena felt tears on her cheeks and didn't bother to wipe them away. Beside her, James Lee was openly crying, and even Marcus Evans, tough as weathered leather, had suspiciously bright eyes. "We did good," Dr. Kimathi said simply. They had. But the story wasn't over. Part 2. The Beautiful Return. 6 months had passed since Messiah's release. The seasons had turned from dry to wet and back to dry again, painting the savanna in alternating palettes of gold and green. Life at the reserve had returned to its rhythm, other rescues, other emergencies, the endless cycle of conservation work that never truly stopped. Dr. Elena Paris had just returned from a veterinary conference in Nairobi where she'd presented Messiah's case to thunderous applause. The surgical video, the recovery statistics, the remarkable post-operative compliance, it had all become a textbook example of successful megafauna intervention. But what Elena couldn't share with the scientific community, what didn't fit into peer-reviewed journals, was the feeling that lingered from those eyes, that moment of recognition that suggested something beyond what science was ready to accept. She was filing paperwork in the reserve's medical station when her radio crackled to life. It was Marcus Evans, and something in his voice made Elena's pulse quicken. "Doc, you need to see this. Sector 7, by the old baobab. Bring your binoculars, and maybe sit down first." Sector 7 was Messiah's territory, the area where his herd had established themselves since his return. Elena had monitored them weekly for the first 3 months. then monthly, confirming that the reintegration had been successful. The last check, 2 weeks ago, had shown all 8 giraffes healthy and thriving. "Is someone hurt?" Elena asked, already grabbing her emergency kit. "No, Doc. Just come. And bring the others if they're around. They'll want to see this." 20 minutes later, Elena stood with James Lee, Sarah Chen, and Ben Wangi at the crest of a small hill overlooking the baobab, a massive tree that had stood for perhaps 1,000 years, its trunk wide enough that a dozen people holding hands couldn't encircle it. And there, in its shade, was a scene that would redefine everything Elena thought she knew about interspecies gratitude. Messiah stood near the tree, his distinctive post-surgical scar barely visible beneath his regrown coat. But he wasn't alone. Pressed against his legs, still wobbly on limbs that couldn't have been more than a few days old, was a baby giraffe. "That's not his calf," James whispered, binoculars pressed to his eyes. "Wrong herd. Look, the mother's over there." He was right. About 50 meters away stood a female giraffe, younger than any in Messiah's herd, watching anxiously as her baby interacted with the massive male. In giraffe society, males typically had little to do with calves that weren't their own. They might tolerate them, but active interaction was rare. But this wasn't mere interaction. As the team watched in amazement, Messiah lowered his great head, gently nuzzling the calf. Then, with movements so careful they seemed choreographed, he began to walk, not away from the calf, but deliberately slowly, looking back repeatedly, as if encouraging it to follow. "He's teaching it to walk?" Sarah breathed, her camera clicking rapidly. "Look where he's leading it," Ben pointed out, his voice thick with emotion. Messiah was guiding the calf directly toward their position. Not aggressively, not accidentally, but with clear intent. Every few steps, he would pause, lower his head to the calf, then look directly at the hidden observers on the hill. "He knows we're here," Elena stated, the certainty of it settling in her bones. When Messiah had brought the calf within 100 meters of their position, close enough that they could see every detail through their binoculars, but far enough to avoid stress, he did something extraordinary. He positioned himself between the calf and its anxious mother, then stood perfectly still, his head turned toward the human observers. And then he waited. "What's he doing?" James whispered. "He's showing us," Ben answered, understanding dawning in his voice. "He's presenting the calf to us, like he's introducing it." For 5 minutes, Messiah stood there, patient as stone, while the calf explored around his legs. Then, satisfied with whatever message he'd intended to convey, he gently guided the youngster back to its mother. The female rushed forward, checking her baby anxiously, but Messiah's calm presence seemed to reassure her. Within moments, all three were browsing peacefully together. "Did that just happen?" Sarah asked, lowering her camera with shaking hands. "It happened," Elena confirmed, though she could barely believe it herself. "He remembered us. After 6 months, he remembered, and he wanted to share this somehow." This alone would have been remarkable enough to challenge conventional understanding of giraffe cognition and memory. But what happened 3 weeks later would elevate Messiah's story from remarkable to legendary. The wet season had arrived with unusual violence that year. Climate change had disrupted traditional weather patterns, turning what should have been gentle rains into torrential downpours that transformed dry riverbeds into raging torrents within hours. The reserve's emergency protocols were activated, all staff on high alert for flash floods and their aftermath. Elena was conducting an emergency check on a group of zebras trapped on a rapidly shrinking island of high ground when the call came in. "Doc, urgent message from the Eastern Patrol." Dispatch crackled over the radio. "They've spotted a vehicle stuck in Sector 4. Looks like researchers. Water's rising fast." Sector 4 was 20 kilometers away, an area where the university occasionally sent graduate students to conduct behavioral studies. Elena's heart sank. If someone was trapped there, with the water rising, "Send the helicopter," she responded immediately. "Negative on flight. Weather's too bad, winds are gusting to 60 knots. Ground rescue only." but the main road's already flooded. The only possible approach is through Sector 7. Sector 7, Messiah's territory. But more problematically, it meant traversing the narrow gorge that connected the two sectors. A gorge that would likely be flooding soon if it wasn't already. "I'm going," Elena announced, already running for her Land Rover. "Send backup when you can. Doc, wait." But Elena had already cut transmission. The drive to Sector 7 was treacherous. Roads had become rivers. Visibility was down to mere meters. And twice Elena had to reverse and find alternate routes when paths she'd traveled hundreds of times proved impassable. By the time she reached the entrance to the gorge, her hands were cramped from gripping the steering wheel, and time was running desperately short. The gorge itself was a testament to nature's power. What was normally a dry passage, barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass, was now a churning channel of brown water. Not deep enough to stop a Land Rover yet, but rising visibly. Elena could see the high water marks on the rocky walls from previous floods, some reaching 3 meters above the current level. If the water reached even half that height while she was in the gorge, she keyed her radio one last time. "Entering the gorge now. If I don't check in within 30 minutes, do not attempt rescue until waters recede." "Elena, don't," James's voice cut through, but she was already moving. The Land Rover's engine roared as she fought the current, wheels spinning for purchase on the submerged rocky floor. Halfway through, the water was already at the door seals. 3/4 through, she could hear it sloshing in the footwells. And then, just as she could see the exit, the engine coughed. "No, no, no," Elena pleaded, pumping the accelerator. The engine caught, sputtered, died. The water was rising faster now, fed by runoff from the plateau above. Elena grabbed her emergency kit, knowing she had perhaps minutes before the vehicle would be swept away. She could try to wade out, but the current was too strong. She could climb the gorge walls, were rough enough but wet rock, and rising water made that nearly suicidal. It was then she heard it, a sound that had no business being in a flooding gorge. The gentle, rumbling vocalization of a giraffe. Messiah appeared at the gorge exit, like an apparition, his massive form backlit by lightning. He stood at the very edge of the flooding passage, his head lowered, looking directly at Elena through her windshield. For a moment, neither moved. Then Messiah did something that defied every instinct his species had evolved over millions of years. He entered the water. Giraffes are capable swimmers, though they rarely do so by choice. Their high center of gravity and long legs make water crossings dangerous, and swift current exponentially more so. But Messiah waded in without hesitation, his powerful legs cutting through the current that would have swept a human away. "What are you doing?" Elena whispered, watching in awe as he approached her vehicle. When Messiah reached the Land Rover, he did something even more extraordinary. He positioned himself upstream of the vehicle, his massive body breaking the current, creating a pocket of calmer water. Then he lowered his head to Elena's window and waited. The message was clear: "Get out. I've got you." Elena didn't hesitate. She grabbed her medical kit, pushed open the door against the current, and immediately felt the power of the water trying to tear her away. But Messiah was there, his body a living wall against the torrent. Elena grabbed onto his leg, something that would normally result in a defensive kick from a wild giraffe, and he stood perfectly still. Step by agonizing step, using Messiah as both shield and support, Elena made her way toward the gorge exit. The water was at her waist now, sometimes higher when waves surged. Without Messiah's bulk breaking the current, she would have been swept away a dozen times. Just as they neared safety, Elena heard it, a deep rumbling from above. Not thunder, rocks. The water had undercut part of the gorge wall, and a section was about to collapse. Messiah heard it too, with a movement faster than Elena had ever seen from a giraffe. He swung his body, essentially scooping Elena with his neck and flinging her toward the bank. She landed hard in the mud, rolled, and came up gasping just in time to see tons of rock crash down where she'd been standing seconds before. The avalanche partially dammed the gorge, sending a wave of water rushing toward Messiah. For a horrible moment, Elena thought he would be swept away. But those powerful legs, evolved to deliver kicks that could kill a lion, held firm. He waded out of the gorge with dignity intact, shaking water from his coat like a dog might after a swim. Elena sat in the mud, rain streaming down her face, staring at the giraffe who had just saved her life. Messiah stood over her, his head lowered, and in his eyes was that same impossible recognition, that same bridge between species that science said shouldn't exist. "You saved me," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "You remembered, and you saved me." Messiah stayed with her until backup arrived, Ben and Marcus in a heavy rescue truck, having found an alternate route. They found Elena sitting beneath a giraffe's protective stance, both soaked, both alive, both part of a story that would be told and retold, but never quite believed by those who hadn't witnessed it. The researchers in Sector 4 were rescued successfully, their vehicle retrieved before the waters claimed it. Elena's Land Rover was recovered 3 days later, battered but repairable. The gorge itself was closed for the remainder of the season, deemed too dangerous for passage. But the real aftermath was in how the story spread. Sarah Chen's photographs of Messiah presenting the calf, of him standing guard over Elena after the rescue went viral within hours of being posted. Major news outlets picked up the story. Scientific journals that had dismissed anecdotal evidence of animal gratitude suddenly wanted to fund studies. Conservation organizations saw donations spike as people around the world were moved by the image of a giraffe risking his life to save the human who had once saved his. Dr. Robert Kimathi was quoted in Nature saying, "We've long suspected that animals have emotional depths we don't fully understand. Messiah's case suggests we've only scratched the surface of interspecies recognition and gratitude." But perhaps the most beautiful aftermath was local. The Maasai communities around the reserve, who had always lived in harmony with wildlife, but had seen that relationships strained by modernization, embraced Messiah's story as validation of their traditional beliefs about the consciousness of animals. Ben's grandfather, the elderly Maasai who had once been among the first rangers, was brought to see Messiah. The meeting was arranged carefully. The 90-year-old man, bent with age but still sharp of mind, was driven to a spot where Messiah's herd often grazed. Elena, Ben, and the others watched from a respectful distance as the elder stood in the open, leaning on his walking stick, waiting. Messiah separated from his herd and approached slowly. When he reached the old man, he lowered his great head until it was level with the elder's face. For a long moment, they regarded each other, the giraffe whose life had been saved by modern veterinary science, and the man who represented generations of traditional wildlife knowledge. The elder reached out a weathered hand and placed it on Messiah's head. He spoke in Ma, words that Ben would later translate as, "You are the bridge, tall one, between the old ways and the new, between your kind and mine. You carry the story now," as if he understood, and who's to say he didn't? Messiah stayed perfectly still for the blessing. When it was complete, he straightened, looked once more at the assembled humans, and walked back to his herd with the dignity of an ambassador who had successfully completed his mission. The ripple effects of Messiah's story extended far beyond that moment. The reserve received funding for a new wildlife medical facility, state-of-the-art equipment that would make future rescues more likely to succeed. A scholarship program was established in Messiah's name, training young Africans in wildlife veterinary medicine. Sarah Chen's photographs raised over $1 million for giraffe conservation efforts across East Africa. But perhaps most significantly, the story changed conversations. Where once discussions of wildlife centered on human-animal conflict, Messiah's story reframed the narrative. It became proof that compassion could flow both ways, that the animals we share this planet with are capable of recognition, memory, and yes, gratitude, in ways we're only beginning to understand. Elena established a long-term study on giraffe cognition and social bonds, with Messiah's herd as the primary subjects. The research, ongoing to this day, has revealed complexities in giraffe emotional intelligence that challenge our understanding of consciousness itself. James Lee went on to develop new anesthesia protocols for megafauna, innovations that have saved dozens of animals across Africa. His paper on Messiah's surgery became required reading in veterinary programs worldwide. Marcus Evans, inspired by the global response to Messiah's story, started a program bringing urban children to the reserve, letting them see firsthand the intelligence and dignity of wild animals. Many of those children would grow up to become conservationists themselves. Sarah Chen's book, The Gratitude of Giants, featuring the complete photographic chronicle of Messiah's journey, won the Wildlife Photographer of the Year award and continues to inspire new generations to see animals not as resources or obstacles, but as fellow travelers on this earth, capable of emotions and connections we're only beginning to fathom. And Messiah himself? He lived another 12 years, fathering several calves, becoming the dominant male of an expanded herd that grew to 15 members. He was spotted regularly by tourists and researchers, always identifiable by the faint scar on his abdomen, a badge of survival, of the day when human hands reached out in compassion and giraffe heart decided to trust. Elena saw him regularly over those years, sometimes officially, during health checks and research observations, sometimes unofficially, when she would drive out alone in the early morning, needing the peace that only the presence of these gentle giants could provide. He would always acknowledge her. Not dramatically, Messiah had made his grand gestures and seemed content to return to normal giraffe life, but his ears would track her movement, and occasionally, when she stood quietly at a respectful distance, he would approach. Not close enough to touch wild animals should remain wild, after all, but close enough to share space, to acknowledge the bond that connected them. The last time Elena saw Messiah was a month before he died, peacefully, of age-related causes. She had brought her daughter, now 5 years old, to see the famous giraffe she'd heard so much about. They sat in the Land Rover, watching the herd browse in the golden light of sunset. "Which one saved you, Mama?" her daughter asked. "The tall one with the scar," Elena replied, pointing to where Messiah stood, still magnificent, despite his advanced age. As if he heard them, and perhaps he did, Messiah turned. He looked at the vehicle for a long moment, then did something Elena had never seen him do before. He walked directly to them, stopping just a few meters away. He lowered his great head, looking through the windshield at Elena, then at her daughter. "Hello, old friend," Elena whispered. Messiah stayed there for perhaps a minute, an eternity in wildlife encounter terms, then straightened and walked back to his herd. It felt, Elena would later say, like a goodbye, like he knew his time was coming and wanted one last moment of connection. When word came of his passing, the response was global. Tributes poured in from around the world. The reserve held a memorial service that drew hundreds locals, tourists, fellow researchers, and conservationists. The Maasai performed traditional songs of passing. Scientists shared data about how Messiah's case had advanced their field. Children who had never been to Africa but felt connected to his story sent drawings, but the most moving tribute came from an unexpected source. The day after Messiah's death, his herd did something unprecedented. All 14 surviving members, including several of his offspring, walked to the medical station, a journey of 10 kilometers from their usual territory. They stood outside the building where Messiah had been treated years before, not eating, not moving, just standing. They stayed for 6 hours. "They're mourning," Ben said simply, watching from inside. "And they came here to do it. They remember this place as where we helped him." Elena couldn't speak through her tears. She went outside, stood among them, something that would normally be dangerous with wild giraffes. But they accepted her presence, some even moving closer, as if seeking comfort or offering it. As the sun set that day, painting the African sky in shades of gold and crimson, the herd finally moved away, but not before the elderly female with the diamond patches, the one who had stood vigil during Messiah's original rescue, approached Elena. She lowered her great head, touching it gently to Elena's shoulder. The contact lasted only a second, but the message was clear. Thank you for trying, for caring, for seeing us as more than animals. In her final journal entry about Messiah, Elena wrote, "Science tells us not to anthropomorphize, not to project human emotions onto animals. But perhaps the real error is in assuming emotions are uniquely human to begin with. Messiah taught us that consciousness, gratitude, and love transcend species. He was living proof that when we extend compassion beyond our own kind, it comes back to us in ways we never imagined possible. His story will be told in scientific journals and nature documentaries. But for those of us who knew him, who saw the recognition in those impossible eyes, who witnessed a giraffe risk his life to save a human who had once saved his, Messiah was more than a case study or a conservation success story. He was a teacher, a friend, a bridge between worlds. And in a time when the relationship between humans and wildlife feels increasingly fraught, his legacy reminds us of a simple truth. Compassion is the only universal language. When we speak it, even to those who walk on four legs and tower above us, we discover that they've been fluent all along. We just needed to learn how to listen. The Messiah Wildlife Medical Center, funded entirely by donations inspired by his story, opened 3 years after his death. To date, it has treated over 500 animals, from tiny dicks to enormous elephants. Each successful rescue adds another verse to the song. Messiah started a song of hope, healing, and the extraordinary things that become possible when humans and animals meet not as superior and inferior, but as fellow inhabitants of this wild, beautiful world. Above the entrance to the center, carved in stone, are words chosen by Elena and approved by everyone who was part of that original rescue. In memory of Messiah, who taught us that gratitude has no species, that consciousness has no boundaries, and that sometimes the ones we save end up saving us. His story continues to ripple outward, inspiring rescues, changing minds, building bridges between worlds that seemed separate but never truly were. In schools across Africa, children learn about the giraffe who remembered. In veterinary programs worldwide, students study his case. In the hearts of everyone who witnessed or heard his story, the truth he embodied lives on. We are all connected, human and animal, predator and prey, the helpers and the helped. And in that connection, in those moments when we reach across the vast space between species with nothing but compassion and hope, miracles become not just possible, but inevitable. Messiah proved that. And somewhere in the African savanna, where his descendants still roam, where the baobab still stands, where the earth remembers the weight of his footsteps and the magnitude of his spirit, his legacy lives on, not in words or images, but in every act of interspecies kindness, every moment of recognition between human and animal, every choice to help rather than harm. The tall one with the scar may be gone, but the bridge he built remains. And we are all still crossing it, one rescue, one moment of compassion, one act of gratitude at a time. End of story. Author's note: this story, while crafted as narrative non-fiction, represents the very real work of wildlife veterinarians and conservationists across Africa and the world. Every day, dedicated professionals risk their lives to save animals, often with no expectation of recognition or reward. The gratitude described here, while perhaps more dramatic than typical encounters, is based on numerous documented cases of animals appearing to recognize and remember their human helpers. If this story moved you, please consider supporting wildlife rescue organizations in your area or internationally. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps make rescues possible. Share this story to raise awareness about the intelligence and emotional depth of the animals we share our planet with. Remember, we are the guardians of the wild. When we choose compassion over indifference, when we see animals as individuals worthy of our effort and care, we don't just save them, we save something essential in ourselves. Thank you for reading Messiah's story. May it inspire you to look at the wildlife around you with new eyes, to recognize the consciousness behind those eyes, and to always choose kindness. for the giants who walk among us, and the humans brave enough to help them.